Welcome to another episode of Tack Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Jude Russo and Joseph Addington. Today we'll be talking about the 12-day war in Iran. Israel and Iran agreed to a ceasefire after President Donald Trump authorized a big attack on three Iranian nuclear sites. Trump slammed Iran and Israel for violating the ceasefire in its early hours, and he had especially strong words for Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel, both in a private conversation with Netanyahu and in public. That ceasefire seems to be holding for now, but Trump seems to have put some kind of pressure on Netanyahu to not violate it, or not violate it in a big way, I should say. Also, an intel report leaked to the media says that the bombings and cruise missile strikes by the US failed to wipe out key components of the nuclear program, but the White House says that the attack indeed did obliterate the targets and destroyed the nuclear program, and so they're rejecting totally the intel that was leaked to CNN, New York Times, and I think some others. So we'll be discussing that as well. And we'll also talk about the mayoral race in New York City, where the socialist Zohran Mamdani defeated the establishment candidate Andrew Cuomo. And afterwards, I'll ask Joseph about a proposal floating around in Congress to sell more than 3,000 square miles of federal lands. That has become very controversial among the conservatives. So Jude, I'm going to start with you on Iran. Obviously, we at TAC and other anti-interventionist conservatives and libertarians as well had sounded the alarm about the possibility of America getting sucked into another regime change war in the Middle East. But now it looks like America's intervention was quite limited. I mean, it's direct intervention. We were doing a lot to help Israel, obviously, but our, direct offensive engagement was just a limited, specific mission, and then we got out. So, in light of everything that's happened and Trump getting the ceasefire, which he announced on Truth Social, and which seems to be holding for now after a rough start, how do you evaluate President Trump's handling of the situation, and what comes next? Do you think?
Like I said on Twitter, I don't really enjoy arguing with success. Uh, so I'm not going to gripe too much. I will say that, as you referred to in your introduction, we still don't really know how much damage was delivered to these sites. As a result, it's difficult to say whether we have set back the Iranian nuclear program by months or by 35 years, as some people have suggested. I think it is worth noting that the reservations that foreign policy restrainers had about such strikes, namely that they wouldn't work, are now being used by the hawkish wing as justification for further strikes. That said, as things stand, my sense is that the president doesn't actually have a whole lot of appetite for regime change and especially boots on the ground. There have been hawkish elements who have said, oh, we could have gotten the regime overthrown or destabilized just by continuing aerial bombardment. That may be true. I think that it's naive, though, to say that regime destabilization in Iran would cash out nicely without some kind of actual ground involvement. I do think that the fact that we haven't confirmed yet what the damage is shows that there may still be some ground operation in the works in the near to middle future. But for now, the president, I think, is a canny politician, even when we don't like what he's doing on foreign policy. I think that he feels like he gave the hawkish wing a big chunk of what they wanted. And now he's listening to the more dovish wing and trying to give them what they want. I think that he is aggravated by the agitation from the Israeli side, especially from Netanyahu in particular, for further American involvement. So, on the whole, in the near to middle term, I'm fairly optimistic that this was a one and done, just like with the Soleimani strikes. I'm happy for my reservations to have been proven vain. That said, I do think it's worth talking about the longer term negative effects or unintended consequences of doing something like this. I think that the first big one, obviously, is that when the Israelis did this strike, it was a question whether the U.S. was involved with it. The CYA that the administration put out is that negotiations were a ruse the whole time to allow this military action to get set up. I don't think I actually buy that. I think that we were pretty clearly caught with our pants down on this one. Uh, but in either case, if you believe the administration's story, if you are negotiating with the United States on a matter of life and death, like actual core national security issue, you have no reason to believe us because we could just be stringing you along so we can bomb you. And if you don't believe our story, it shows that we can just get jerked around by junior allies, which is also not something that creates a lot of confidence in American diplomatic credibility. So I think that that's one problem. I do think that in the middle term, there's a good chance that it encourages small countries and middle-sized countries to pursue nuclear proliferation secretly. This wouldn't have happened if Iran already had the bomb. If you look at the list of nations that pursued proliferation without asking questions and sort of apologized for it later, or didn't apologize for it later, you've got Israel, North Korea, India, Pakistan. On the other side of the ledger, you have countries that had nuclear programs but negotiated limits or gave them up altogether. You have Ukraine, Iraq, Iran, South Africa. I think that one list there is significantly more successful than the other as far as
Libya.
maintaining national integrity goes. So I think that there's a sort of malign lesson here if you're not one of those far out Cato libertarians who think that total proliferation is actually the route to world peace.
Yeah, I also don't buy this idea that diplomacy was a ruse or deception campaign, certainly not from the beginning. I was open to that explanation for a while when it was first bubbling up in the media. We were seeing some reports of that shortly after Israel moved in, and then Trump's initial response, like the day after Israel's strike, suggested that he did have total awareness of what Israel was going to do, and he thought the strikes were great and they were really successful, and Iran should have made a deal. This is what they had coming, and it happened on the 61st day after the deadline was reached. Trump had set a 60-day deadline, so I thought, okay, maybe this was intended.
Does that arithmetic
But
actually work out? I haven't
well, it's
counted
hard.
myself, but like I've heard people say that the arithmetic for the 60-day thing doesn't actually work out.
It was always very ambiguous because Trump had sent a letter to the Supreme Leader Khamenei early in his administration saying that he wanted to get a deal, and people didn't know, okay, does this start the day he sends it? Does it start the day Khamenei reads it? They had to get it to Khamenei through mediators. Does it start the day that negotiations begin? That wasn't clear. I don't think that we know the full contents of that letter. Maybe Trump was clear in the letter, but I don't think anybody knows exactly when it started. But a consensus did develop about when the 60 days were up, and that was on June 12th. That was the 60th day. And then Israel did it the next day, even though it seemed like there were going to be a sixth round of negotiations between the U.S. and Iran on Sunday. So this was only 2 days before that Israel went in. Like I said, I'm skeptical of the deception campaign, ruse narrative, and I think that Trump should be he should make it more clear that that narrative is false in some way. Because how the heck can Iran trust us now? Trump said that Iran and the U.S. might be talking next week. It seems like he still wants to get some kind of nuclear deal, although he said at this NATO summit today that he doesn't really care anymore because they destroyed the nuclear program, the U.S. and Israel did, so it doesn't really matter as much, but they'll try to get some sort of document signed, he said. Well, I just don't see how Tehran is going to trust us enough after the past 2 weeks to actually do that. Not only because they might think this was a deception campaign, the whole diplomacy was intended to lull them into a false sense of security, but because during Israel's attack, Trump used the first person plural. He said, "We're doing this. We controlled the airspace." When Israel's fighter jets controlled the airspace. I mean, he told everyone in Tehran to evacuate. He sent a very threatening message about the possibility of killing Khamenei that was on Truth Social. Um, and I just don't see how this is stable ground for diplomacy with Iran. But Iran did say that they would come back to the negotiation table. It wasn't clear what exactly would be negotiated, but they would come back to talk to the US if Israel stopped its military campaign against Iran, which might be one reason that Trump seems to have leaned really hard on Netanyahu. Because shortly after the ceasefire, Iran fired, I think, one missile at like 7 a.m. a few minutes after
Right.
this. It was
It's
unclear
sort of
when the
unclear what
ceasefire
happened there.
started. And then maybe two more. Neither of them hit their target. I think one was just like a wayward missile. The others were easily intercepted. And then Israel dispatched like a fleet of fighter jets to target like 20 sites in Tehran, and Trump was telling Netanyahu, bring those fighter jets back, tell the pilots to come home, don't drop the bombs. He was saying that in private messages and on Truth Social. And the Israelis ended up doing a kind of compromise position. They attacked one site just outside of Tehran. They took out a radar site. And they were going to have a devastating strike on Tehran, which they elected not to do in the end, seemingly because Trump didn't let them do so. Because then Iran would have been obligated to respond, and the ceasefire would never really have stuck. It would never really have taken effect. Joseph, I'll ask you the same question I threw to Jude, and you can respond also to what we were saying. But how do you evaluate Trump's performance throughout all of this, and especially the decision to strike Iran using these B 2 bombers, and then his role in the ceasefire?
Sure. I think for Trump, what Trump is often really concerned with is coming out of situations looking like he has the position of strength. And so I think that's one of the reasons that you kind of see this hesitation when he is attempting to decide, whether the U.S. is going to join the airstrike campaigns. At first, he's very positive, because it looks like the strike from Israel certainly demonstrated a lot of strength. It obliterated the command structure of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It absolutely demolished a lot of Tehran's air defenses and a lot of their missile launching capabilities. And so you can see that Trump, if you look at his social media, it looks like he's very caught up in sort of this, the power of this demonstration. But then afterwards, when it comes down to the question of what is the U.S. going to do, well, then there's the question of is the U.S. going to, there's sort of this bind on the one hand, if Trump joins, it looks like Netanyahu can dictate American policy over the head of Trump, when he's trying to do negotiations. On the other hand, if he doesn't, it might look like he's weak and afraid of getting involved in Iran and afraid of the Ayatollah. And so you have this period where he's trying to push for a diplomatic outcome where he can say, okay, like Iran came to us and we made a settlement, which is why he was constantly suggesting to the press that the Iranians wanted to talk to the White House, even when they explicitly denied this. I think he was hoping that Iran would come, and then he would be able to say, "Okay, like out of our generosity, we are willing to make this deal." Um, that didn't happen for a variety of reasons, obviously, and so the next, if you're looking to come off in the position of strength, it's easier to do that when bombing somebody than not bombing somebody. Um, and so he made the call to, bomb Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Um, but once that's done, once he's made the point, once he's gained the position of strength, then he can cut back and play to his more negotiating, deal making, uh, not necessarily conflict averse, but certainly averse to getting the United States entangled in situations where he doesn't have as much explicit control. So that's my personal read on the situation, and, I think it actually turned out very well for Trump, in many ways. He did come out looking like he has the position of strength. It doesn't look like he was being dictated to by the, Israelis or the Iranians, especially when he was able to lean on Netanyahu and to get him to call off the big strike that they were going to do in retaliation to Iran. And, he was able to pull off a Middle Eastern intervention, say that he accomplished his goal of preventing Iran from gaining nuclear weapons and avoiding entangling the United States in any drawn out conflict for now. Um, Certainly, there are is a question of the long-term feasibility of the plan. Is this actually going to work to deter Iran from getting a nuclear bomb in the long term? I think, if anything, it will probably have the opposite effect. Iran now knows that the only way that they will be able to stop Israel from doing to them what they just did is with the threat of nuclear weapons. Um, and so in the long run, it might make things worse. But in the short run, it seems to have been, an extraordinary political success.
Yeah, it's almost like sometimes it seems like Trump is in touch with these irrational elements of the collective unconscious or something where he just knows, okay, we need a big explosion and then Israel and Iran can stop, because they're both kind of ready to wrap this thing up. We had indications of that from both Tehran and from Israel. But he just thought, okay, we need some B 2 bombers to drop 30,000 pound bunker busters, make a huge explosion, make a huge fire, and then they'll be able to wrap it up. I'll say in terms of consequences beyond just the short-term political consequences of this, which I agree with you, Joseph, are good for Trump. I mean, Republicans and especially MAGA, self-described MAGA Republicans liked Trump's decision to strike Iran. It was unpopular among the general electorate, but it's not going to move a bunch of people. You know, most people don't really care, to be frank. But as far as the nuclear question, I agree with you that Iran is going to want to accelerate its nuclear program now. I don't think they've yet made the decision, okay, we do need to go for the bomb, but it certainly must make them more inclined to get it. It looks like they're going to suspend cooperation with the IAEA, that's the UN nuclear watchdog, which would be really bad because then we would have a lot less insight into what Iran's nuclear program entails. The reason we know how many what stockpiles of uranium they have and what they're enriching to is because they actually cooperate really closely with the IAEA. They file reports, they let inspectors come in, go basically wherever they want. It does seem like Iran has some secret sites that they haven't told the IAEA about. But nevertheless, it's good to have, the UN watchdog in Iran maintaining a presence so that we know what's going on exactly. That might be coming to an end depending on what the Supreme National Security Council or whatever it's called in Iran decides. But the parliament approved the decision to suspend cooperation. Trump said at the NATO summit today, he was asked, or maybe it was last night when he arrived or something, he was asked if Iran tries to rebuild their nuclear program, would you strike them again? And he said, sure. So I think he's kind of crossed the Rubicon in a way where it's like the baseline expectation of what Trump will do is like higher. Like we
Right.
have this
We're,
now
we're
perpetual
committed to mowing the
justification.
grass. We're committed to mowing the
Exactly.
grass at this point, which I think is undesirable and an unstable long term way of doing things. Uh, but I could be wrong, and we won't know for 10 years.
And if he does start to mow the grass, I mean, that would be unpopular. That would become unpopular quickly, I think.
It would become unpopular in two ways, right? People of our broad inclination would say, why are we still dropping bombs on the Iranians 8 years later? And people of a more hawkish inclination will say, why don't we just finish them off so that we don't have to do this every 18 months? So it is like mowing the grass is like, a realist solution that gets forwarded occasionally by, hawkish realists, like, your sort of Tom Cotton aligned people. And, the idea is that it's just like punitive raids in the 19th century. Uh, and I just don't think that it's politically stable. It's also very expensive. One thing we haven't touched on at all is how much this little caper in the past week has cost us. We are running low on interceptor missiles. We can't make them fast enough to replace them. And that's after, basically 2 weeks of everybody, lobbing ordnance at each other. If we were actually in a real war, we'd have a problem.
And we haven't touched yet on the legality of the strikes either, which could be something
Yeah.
that could be a big deal in the future.
Maybe we should talk about that. I want to add in response to what Jude says. Yeah, these THAAD missiles, the Theater High Altitude Air Defense, these air defense missiles are very important for our force posture in the Pacific, to deter China. and we only make it's like a ridiculously low number. It's like we make like 24 of these a year. Okay. And we have them in Israel. I mean, we developed all three of their different types of missile defense systems. We gave them our Patriot defense systems, their batteries and those interceptors, and we have US operated THAAD missile defense in Israel. And all of those things were engaged in the last 2 weeks.
There's one in Ukraine too, right? Or there's one that they keep swapping between Ukraine and Israel. I forget what.
They moved counter drone air defense from Ukraine to Israel, and then a few months ago they moved a Patriot defense system from Israel to uh, Ukraine, but that wasn't even in use because we gave Israel newer stuff, but they just kind of keep stockpiles of the old stuff in case they need it. But yeah, on this legality question, I mean, Joseph, did you want to add anything about it? Or did you really mean to say we haven't talked about the illegality of this strike, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, well, I mean, to the extent that we are at all committed to as a constitutional republic, to the idea that Congress should be declaring war, and we haven't just surrendered it as a fait accompli to, the president can do whatever he wants on foreign policy for any reason, then we should at least be asking the question, is the president actually authorized to do this? We have various authorizations for the use of military force. Um, but I don't think that anyone in the administration has bothered to cite or attempt to justify to Congress what the actual statute is that the president is using in order to make this raid on Iran. And so now you do have questions in Congress. You had Thomas Massey bringing up the question, and I believe you even had articles of impeachment filed by Representative Al Green over this, saying that this was a constitutional usurpation of congressional authority. Obviously, that's not probably going to go anywhere. But, considering that as Americans, we probably do believe that it is the power of Congress to declare war, uh, we should interrogate, not just for the question of Iran, but for all potential interventions going on in the future. Um, was this actually legal? And the question is, if it is of dubious legality, which I would say that it is, especially considering that there's no effort to justify it according to any of the current authorizations of military force, um, what do the repercussions need to be? And is there something that Congress should do to change the situation? Because as it is, Congress has ceded a vast amount of its, power over military intervention to the president, but that's not something that has to be that way. We can the House of Representatives and the Senate could change that to some extent if they wanted, you know, given the existing constraints of politics.
Yeah, I mean, that's all nice, but I don't think that Congress is going to suddenly start wanting to do its job.
It certainly doesn't seem
this is the
like the
basic,
Democrats
like one of
do.
the basic problems with the modern American constitutional order. Madison was just wrong. People do not guard their power. They are not jealous for power. Madison was jealous for power. He was going to defend his power against everybody else. But Congress is extremely happy just to cut checks and leave all of the difficult decisions to the judiciary and the White House.
They're jealous for their offices.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that, I think that the only way this is going to change is if there is a serious impeachment effort, which there is not going to be because Al Green is not serious. He files articles for impeachment pretty much every Congress. He's a showman, and there's not anything wrong with that necessarily, but it's not actually government. The only way that the presidential war powers are going to get rolled back is if there is an actual opportunistic element where hostile Congress thinks they can really nail him on doing this. And so we don't have a hostile Congress. We probably will in a year. But by that point, nobody's going to remember this episode. The fact that it didn't go horribly wrongly means that even if there were a hostile Congress, they would think twice about going against the politically popular thing. I mean, I know that, Andrew, you said that you thought that you had seen that the strikes were net negative. I'd seen polling to the opposite, that the strikes are popular, but that people don't want boots on the ground. So it's sort of difficult because when you poll this particular kind of question, it really depends on how you phrase it. But I think that, especially, you know, in the not deep blue coastal portions of the country, I think that it's fair to say that this is like probably 52% popular, at least, right? Um, so I'm not actually concerned concerned about presidential war powers getting reclaimed by Congress anytime soon. Um, if somebody did, if the administration were embarrassed to providing uh, a justification, though, I do suspect it would be the old warhorse, the 2001 AUMF, which there is some appetite to repeal. There's been bipartisan discussion of it in the Senate, but not exactly on the front of anyone's stove right now.
It's kind of interesting, this isn't a legal justification really, and I don't know if the White House has articulated it, although I think Netanyahu has made reference to it. But Western powers pressured the IAEA to find Iran in violation of its non-proliferation obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the main treaty that governs nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And the IAEA Board of Governors indeed did find Iran in breach. And then the next day, Israel attacked. And a lot of people cite that report, which, if you read it closely, the main finding that's concerning pertains to some nuclear weapons research that Iran did in 2003. And it's long been the U.S. intelligence assessment that Iran had a nuclear weapons program that they suspended in 2003 and that they haven't reconstituted it or wanted to get a bomb since then. And there was some other stuff about like trace amounts of um, nuclear material that the IAEA wanted to know, like where did this come from? It seems to suggest you're doing some things that we don't know about because we don't know of any activities that would have left these trace amounts. But it wasn't as big a deal as it was made out to be. But it seemed to provide some sort of legal justification, just in the sense of, oh, Iran is in violation of a treaty that needs to be enforced, which is absurd because Israel's not a party to that treaty. The last thing I'll say on that is, the Democrats, a big part of this story of how Congress isn't pushing back against the White House on its striking Iran without congressional authorization is that the Democrats don't seem to care that much. Like the top Democrat in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, and the top Democrat in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, I mean, they might have had they whined a little bit. Yeah. When Jeffries was asked about this War Powers Act sponsored by Ro Khanna, he said, "Oh, I haven't had time to look at it." And it's like, well, what the heck else are you doing? Like, that was right after we had bombed Iran. It seemed like this might be a continuing campaign. I can't imagine anything more important for him to have been doing. But in any case, I agree with what you said. I think we need to move on. Let's talk about this mayoral election in New York where Zohran Mamdani, the he was an unknown personality when the race started. I guess he was involved in New York politics. He's a socialist. He's a democratic socialist. He's also a very pro-Palestinian person. In college, he started some student movement. I can't remember which one exactly, but it's kind of like a pro-Palestinian college move thing. And he's an immigrant. He's a Muslim. I think he's of Indian ancestry, but was born in Uganda. So he's got an interesting background. And now he'll be, I think, probably the mayor, although now he still needs to, this was just the Democratic primary. Now he needs to go up against Eric Adams, right? Um, so this is what everyone's talking about today. What do you guys have to say about it? What's your take?
Well, where to begin? So I think that it's first worth saying that Andrew Cuomo could still run in the general election. There are a variety of ways to do that in New York. You can run in the general as an independent. There are a number of third parties which can provide vehicles for Democrats who want to mount a general campaign, but for whatever reason, were shut out during the primary. So that said, I think he's cooked. Nobody likes him. It's over for him. He's never going to be president. Many such cases. I do think that so that leaves Eric Adams, who is the current mayor. He's a Democrat, but he's running as an independent because he's hilariously corrupt and is in trouble for various reasons. He's also a C+ mayor for New York. Like, not exceptional, but much better than de Blasio. Probably much better than Mamdani's going to be. So I could see the city coming to its senses and rallying around Adams. I think that's the only viable solution to not putting Mamdani in charge, which is undesirable for a number of reasons that I will get to in a moment. Then you have the Republican Curtis Sliwa, who, as far as I can tell, is like actually a good guy, but is also sort of not viable because he's a Republican in New York, and his whole shtick is that he started a neighborhood watch and he wears a red beret everywhere. So much as I would love to see Mr. Sliwa win, he's a sort of perennial candidate for the Republicans in New York. I don't know about this time, but the last time he ran unopposed in the Republican primary because there are about 15 Republicans in New York. They all live in Staten Island, and none of them want to run. So I think that while Mamdani obviously has a lot of momentum right now, I don't think that it's actually a foregone conclusion that he's going to win the general, especially because a lot of the stuff that he supports does, in fact, go against the things that you traditionally want a New York mayor to do. New York mayor basically needs to do 4 things. Don't mess with the schools. New York has a very good, very efficiently run public school system traditionally, with several very high-powered merit-based magnet schools, Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, things like that. When mayors try to do stuff about that, because mysteriously only Asian and Jewish kids test into these places, it becomes very unpopular. De Blasio tried to institute race-based acceptances for Stuyvesant. That's one of the reasons that he is more or less run out of the city on a rail. So the first thing you got to do is don't mess with the schools. Second thing you got to do is make sure the subway is clean, safe, basically running on time. De Blasio really messed this up. Mamdani hasn't evinced any sort of big infrastructure ideas, but one of the aspects of keeping the subway usable is making sure that it's not constantly infested by the violently psychotic homeless, which brings us to the third thing a New York mayor needs to do, which is support the police pretty unconditionally, smile at press conferences when they occasionally brutalize somebody who is acting up. Mamdani has at various points proposed not prosecuting shoplifting, mass release of offenders based on age and other factors. All of the sort of soft on crime stuff that was very, very sexy in 2020 and much less sexy in 2025 after we saw those policies result in a mass homicide spike across the country. New Yorkers, even liberal New Yorkers, are very defensive about the streets actually being safe to walk on. They are not big on letting knife criminals out running in the street, irrespective of their demographic factors. I think that that's something that will play very poorly with Mamdani. The police union is very powerful in New York because of the fact that it's important to New Yorkers. Even if he were to win, I think he would have a very bad relationship with the police department, which does count in New York politics. And then the fourth thing that a New York mayor needs to do is keep the city basically solvent. Famously, John Lindsay failed to do that. The federal government refused to bail out New York City, resulting in the famous Daily News headline, Ford to Lindsay, drop dead. Keeping the city solvent is pretty important. Mamdani has a farrago of big money welfare ideas. He's not going to do things that are especially friendly to the tax base of New York. So I think that he will be more of a fiscal disaster for New York than even de Blasio was. And de Blasio was a big spender. So I think that the fact that Mamdani is very popular with a particular segment of New Yorkers who are very energized, showed up to the polls, but New York as a whole is a machine city and has very sort of concrete, what are you going to do for me concerns. Like there's that checklist that you go through when somebody runs for mayor. And basically everything that Mamdani wants to do goes directly against the checklist of you are a normal mayor that I will vote for. So I actually am not despairing. I think that Eric Adams, assuming that Cuomo doesn't run and split the normal people vote, I think that Adams has a pretty decent chance of actually getting back in there.
Makes sense. I mean, he'll get Republicans and he'll get African Americans, presumably,
Right, who
based
voted
on the
against
voter.
Mamdani in the Democratic
Right.
primary.
White progressives put Mamdani over the top, and there's a correlation between income and voting for Mamdani. I don't know if there's a perfect correlation, but above 100,000, much more likely to vote for him than like under 50,000.
Yeah, I
Joseph,
mean,
what?
the New York Times broke it out low income, middle income, high income, and I don't know what the actual brackets there were, but whatever they were calling low income was plus 10 Cuomo, and whatever
Mhm.
they were calling middle income was, I think, plus 7 Mamdani, and high income even higher.
It
Yeah,
was
so it is a
under
correlation.
50K, 50 to 100K, and then over 100K.
Mm-hmm. Joseph, you want to add anything on this race?
Um, sure. So, I mean, Hughes talked about the practical aspects for New York, but I think it's important to touch on the fact that, you know, this is really a harbinger of kind of the Democratic Party's direction generally. I think it's important to realize that, the reason that Mamdani won the primary, well, first because Cuomo's kind of an awful candidate, but generally because Cuomo represents the establishment Democratic Party. Um, which also are often awful candidates. So I suppose that you can consider those equivalent. Um, a lot of the enthusiasm towards Mamdani, especially from the big base, the major sort of players that he had, his most enthusiastic voting base were, of course, Asians. Mamdani played really heavily into his origin as a South Asian immigrant, although he was born in Uganda. But anyways, making ads in Hindi and so forth. Um, and so he got really, really high vote count among Asian immigrants, but then also among white progressives. And especially among white progressives, the reason is that he was seen as putting mud in the eye of the establishment Democratic Party, which is incredibly unpopular both in society at large and among Democrats. And Mamdani has very much a sort of energy to him. He's youthful, he's charismatic, and the kind of sort of vaguely racialized socialism that he proposes is very much in line with what the activist base in the party, college educated, white, upper class, professional middle class people find attractive. And so I think that you are going to see that Mamdani type candidates are going to be the future of the Democratic Party. And the fact that he can win the Democratic primary in the largest and most important city in the country is an important harbinger of things to come for Democrats generally, especially once the old guard of the establishment party dies off and leaves politics and retires.
Yeah, it's funny. if we just kind of set aside his ideology, and obviously I oppose totally basically his entire ideology, especially, when it comes to law and order in New York City. Like, I'm a big believer in like firm
Right, you lived
policing.
in Chicago,
Uh,
so you're used to the
right.
other thing.
Right, exactly. And you don't want to turn it into Chicago. Although I think that New York City crime is way down from what it was during right after the summer of George Floyd.
Right. Well, and that's
So
because Eric Adams knows the
right,
checklist. He's a former
but it's
police
kind of like a
commissioner.
good times make weak men or whatever it is. Like that issue is less salient, and so New Yorkers may not vote on law and order. Although whenever New Yorkers reliably will elect a tough on crime mayor when things get bad, and
Yes.
but right now things are not bad in terms of the crime statistics. And when I go to New York, I never feel in danger lately. Last year and a half or so.
I think that
Um,
I think it's still
mhm,
pretty fresh in the memory, though.
yeah,
I do think that I was last in New York in January, and I do think that there are still some state guard deployments on certain subway platforms. So I don't think that the reason that Adams got elected was he's a former police commissioner and said we're ending the silly stuff. And I still think that that is a fairly fresh memory for a lot of New Yorkers.
yeah, I'm sure it is. I mean, that was kind of a traumatizing experience if you're living in a big city. What one thing that we haven't touched on, which the weirdest thing about this campaign to me was how it became about Israel. Like the campaign was basically about Israel, cost of living, and immigration. At least cost of living and immigration are what Mamdani wanted to make it about. He has all these kind of socialist ideas to address the cost of living crisis, like rent freezes and government-run grocery stores, and then on immigration, he's really big about New York being a sanctuary city. He says these laws protect us because we're like 40% of us are foreign born. Among younger New Yorkers, it's an even higher percentage. But the media and the Democratic Party establishment really made the race about Israel, and it produced some truly absurd moments. Like in the debate, the the moderators kept asking about Israel. There was this moment when they were saying, "Where is the first country you would go to after becoming mayor?" And it was obviously implied that you're supposed to say Israel, and so every single person, say it was a crowded field, so there were a lot of people on stage. Everyone said, "I would go to Israel to support our ally." One guy said, "I'd go to Israel and Ukraine." And and then Mamdani had some answer like, I can't remember exactly what he said, but the vibe was like, "I'm gonna stay in New York and look out for New Yorkers." And whenever he was asked about Israelis, he said, "I care about Jewish New Yorkers and I'll talk to them and about their concerns, but I don't care about Israel." And that just became such a focus of attention for the media. Like he was on Stephen Colbert, and Colbert asked him like three questions about Israel before he asked him about New York. And it's like, okay, it's New York. It's the most important city in the world. It's America's best city in my estimation. So, I guess it kind of makes sense that a mayor of New York would have to think about foreign affairs,
It's worth
but
mentioning that it is also salient because part of the issue with Eric Adams is that he's being bribed hugely by the Turkish government.
it's not that huge. I mean, his bribes are pretty pathetic. He gets to ride like first class if he goes in this like really circuitous route that passes through Ankara to get to wherever he's going. It's like the most pathetic bribe. Like Bob Menendez is taking like literal gold bars. Come
Eric
on, do you
Adams is
really
going
want?
for the Turkish airline miles.
I can't remember what it was exactly, but when I read about it, I just thought this is the most pathetic bribe I've ever read at a high level
Yeah,
of politics.
it it wasn't that good, granted. The best part is where his secretary is corresponding with the person at like Turkish Airlines, and they're having a complete miscommunication about like the order of magnitude of the bribe. Uh,
I
um,
haven't seen that. Yeah. Uh,
but yes, what foreign country are you going to be in hock to is a relevant question for New York mayors. It turns out.
yeah. And Adams did say Israel, not Turkey. Um, but yeah, I just thought that was so strange. I mean, and as I said, when he was a student, he founded this chapter of like students. I don't know the names of all these pro-Palestinian organizations, but it's something like Students for Peace or Palestinian Justice or something. And then he is associated somehow with this phrase "globalize the Intifada." That's the word. It means uprising, but when capitalized, it refers to a specific event or two events. The second one of which was violent. Palestinian uprising against Israel.
So I'm happy to provide color on that. I realize we're pressed for time, but it's very funny. So I'm happy to go
Please,
on.
please do go for it.
So my understanding is that Mr. Mamdani went on the Never Trump Conservative podcast for the Bulwark. And his interviewer asked him whether he would condemn the phrase globalize the Intifada. And he gave a bunch of nonsense that cashed out to no, I'm not going to condemn that phrase. Which was the same week that Bill Kristol, who runs the Bulwark, decided that Trump might be good because we might be doing regime change in Iran. And when Trump showed hours later hesitancy to do regime change in Iran, so that this proves that Trump's a fascist. So the Bulwark managed a full spectrum alienation last week. Platform to globalize the Intifada guy, say we should overthrow Iran, and suggest that the guy who just bombed Iran is a fascist because he's not actually going to put boots on the ground. Literally nobody came out of that one feeling good about the Bulwark.
I know the David Frums and Bill Kristols of the world have just been ridiculous lately. They say that Trump is this aspiring authoritarian who wants to overthrow American democracy, but then when he, without congressional approval, bombs Iran, they think, oh well, I might have to
He has
rethink
his
that. He's
points.
not.
Because he
uh,
won't go to war with Iran without a congressional declaration of war, then he's obviously an authoritarian.
yeah, yeah. It's really annoying how unprincipled they are. I mean, their principle is basically, you know, Israel, as far as I can tell. And with Mamdani, as I mentioned, I don't like his ideology. I do think he's a charismatic guy. He's got a good smile. He can say things that when other people said them would annoy you, but coming from him, it sounds like he's kind of friendly. He seems pretty sharp. He's only 33 years old. He looks young and fresh. And so right now that, it's an anti-establishment moment. It seems like it always is, but that's just kind of building.
He's got the
And
Obama thing going.
yeah.
It's funny we talk about Bill Kristol. The way that he talks about Mamdani is actually literally the way that he used to talk about Obama at the beginning of Obama's campaign, where he said, oh yeah, I disagree with him, but he's very impressive. He's very
Mhm.
charismatic. So I
Well,
think
I'm surprised that Bill Kristol took that line because some other, people who can be categorized as neoconservatives or
they
very
want to deport him.
pro-Israel, and yeah, they see his rise to power as a harbinger of like really dark days for the
Right.
Jewish community in New
Creeping
York.
Sharia,
Yeah.
Eternal 2002.
What is the guy? There's I can't believe I forgot his name. Who is the famous Holocaust survivor? He wrote books, and his son is now
Elie
kind of
Wiesel.
pro. Yeah, his son, he's often on like MSNBC and stuff. I was staying in a hotel recently in DC, or in Maryland rather, and I was just I never watched cable news, and the Iran thing was getting really hot. So I was like, what are cable news saying right now? And I turned on Fox News, and they're talking about the importance of like B-2 bombers and how cold these things are, and we need to like take out Iran. And then I'm like, okay, that's the pro-war position. Let's switch over to MSNBC. And this guy's son was talking, in very kind of quiet, sweet, non-militaristic tones, talking about the importance of standing with Israel. And he released an ad basically comparing Mamdani to Hitler. Like the imagery, the visual rhetoric made the comparison where it's like showing images of Hitler and the rise of Nazis, and then showing Mamdani and his like pro-Palestinian activism. And from what I can tell, this is just ridiculous. Like, there's a lot to criticize Mamdani about. I don't think he's an anti-Semite, as far as I can tell. I mean, the other Jewish candidate in the Democratic primary was like his main ally, right? Um,
Right. And I
they're
mean,
supporting.
the
Mhm.
problem with left wing pro-Palestinian groups, especially, is that it's it is a big mix, right? Like, you'll go to marches and you'll hear people chanting Kaibar, Kaibar, like, and just because those people, because it's a cause-based group, will be in with like the most boring secular New Republic reading leftists that
Yeah.
you can imagine. Uh, so like, um, I
Almost a
don't
purely
actually.
aesthetic movement, essentially.
Well, I mean, but it is also, like actually cause-based, right? Like, it's like how Pat Buchanan and the unions left, right, but they're on the same side of the trade issue, right? So unfortunately, when you're actually, trying to advance a political cause rather than an ideology, you do end up having to deal with people that you don't necessarily like all that much. Um, so, I don't blame people who are like sort of spooked about, like, weird left wing pro Palestinian movements, because sometimes they are actually like pretty horrible. But I haven't seen evidence that like Mamdani himself is one of those guys out there, you know, chanting
No, there are
hateful
definitely
stuff.
people throwing panic up about how Mamdani is some kind of harbinger of like Sharia law in New York, which is
Like
absurd
Charlie
because
Kirk. Mm.
Mamdani is Muslim basically just because he sees it as like a racial thing, like an identity thing. Like there's no actual substance of religion
Right. I mean,
there,
he's about
and
as
he is
Muslim as Cuomo is Catholic.
yeah, and so it's it's very much again kind of an aesthetic sort of identity thing, and not at all related to Sharia law. He's much more likely to march down the street with trans activists than
Yeah.
make women start wearing burqas.
Yeah, he's a socialist feminist. Like that's how he used to describe. He actually relaxed his wokeism during this campaign, at least rhetorically. But he. I agree with you totally. Like there's no Sharia law coming. Like there is a tradition of like Marxist Islamism. Like you could. I guess it's not a total contradiction in terms to call him a Marxist Muslim, as like Charlie Kirk is doing, but he's not like
He's not
focusing
MEK.
on. Right, right, yeah. But he's bad. Everyone should vote for Eric Adams. Keep New York safe. I have family there,
He
and
has the
my wife
divine
goes
right.
there sometimes.
He does have the divine right.
Yeah. He compared himself to Jesus, right? Eric
He
Adams.
compared us, well, but what Joe's referring to is he went on a radio show, and somebody asked him, why do you think you should be mayor? And he says, I'm mayor because God gave me the authority to be mayor. Uh,
So blunt. Yeah,
yeah.
the most recent thing is I can't remember what quote he had. You might remember it.
He
But
was
and
the night that we bombed the hell out of Iran. He was smoking hookah at a hookah bar called the Persian Sands. That's sort of the latest thing that he's been up to.
I think we should move on, with that. Maybe things are getting out of hand. We might have to skip the federal lands thing, unless, Joseph, can you describe in like 1.5 minutes what this bill is about and what the controversy is about surrounding it?
Yeah, sure. So very quickly, Senator Mike Lee of Utah proposed, as part of the big beautiful bill, to sell off some portion of the federal lands, and it's about I think between 0.25 and 0.5% of the federal lands in the United States, exempting national parks and certain things like that. Anyways, essentially, he sold it as this is how we're going to unlock more affordable housing, land for housing development and so forth. And we can use the sales to help, generate a bit of revenue to assist with the budget. And this was very controversial. On the right and the left, there were a lot of people who were extremely unhappy with the idea of selling off federal lands um, that are currently public and privatizing them. A lot of people saying that they were going to be bought up by BlackRock. Other people, especially like sportsmen's coalitions, upset that this would hamper access to the natural world. Um, and so this ended up being a very big controversy. Uh, but it's looking like it's somewhat moot because the Senate parliamentarian said that it didn't qualify under the Byrd rule, so it can't be part of the reconciliation bill. Lee has said that he's going to revise it and changed some of the specifications of the bill in order to comply sort of with the things that were causing the most public outrage. Um, and so yeah, we will see where things go from there.
I do think it's worth mentioning that that federal land use is sort of a chronic issue for conservatives in the West. Like, does anybody remember the Bundys,
Mm-mm.
the ranchers who were like trying to
Oh
use
yeah,
Yeah, the
yeah. Of
whole
federal
course I do.
shooting
lands
Yeah,
standoff
in
with the
various ways?
feds.
yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of cool. Like, I'm not gonna lie. I'm
Hmm.
enough of a libertarian that actually fighting the federal government, you know, does it for me a little bit. But I wish we had Spencer on because since he's actually from the West, I think he would have more to say about it. But there is, the Trump thing more than basically any other Republican presidency, probably since HW, is which I guess is only one, right? Is a coalitional thing. He is giving things to the people who voted for him. Even in the Iran stuff that we saw earlier this week, he gave the Hawks some bombs, but then he gave diplomacy and stopping short of regime change to the Dubs. So I think that the federal land stuff is at least in part him paying off the people that he made various promises to in this part of the country.
Makes sense. I need to look into the details. It's the kind of thing that is easy to be opposed to just when you hear about it and kind of imagine what it entails, you know. And I have you guys ever seen like Judge Dredd? You're familiar with that comic or the movie? You know
Oh
how
yeah,
the setting of it is just this endless. It's clearly inspired by like Egypt or something. Just this endless urban, landscape with no nature in sight. Just this kind of ugly blob of concrete. And whenever this kind of thing happens or this kind of proposal comes up of selling off federal lands, I just am aesthetically opposed and spiritually opposed. Like you can never get that back, if the federal government does that. Um, but I need to look into the details. I know that Lee is trying to reassure some concerned, kind of crunchy conservatives that it's not as bad as they say, and we're still going to protect like our parks and like hunting grounds and stuff like that. So we'll see where that goes. But I think we need to move on to picks of the week, where we each pick an article from the American Conservative from the past 7 days or so that we want to highlight. I'm going to pick Peter Sleskin and Jennifer Kavanaugh's article, It's Time to Get Out for Good. I think it made a lot of important points after Trump bombed Iran about his opportunity to kind of de escalate, make sure this doesn't go any further, and then looking ahead to what to do next. We need to start getting out of the Middle East, reconsidering our basing structure there, and avoiding these forever wars in the Middle East. They thought he had an opportunity to do that. And so far, he's kind of doing what they were recommended. So it's an interesting piece to read still. Jude, what's your pick of the week?
I'm going to actually go with Addington here's The End of Peronism, which is about Christina Kirchner going to jail. Not really, she's going to house arrest. But it's an interesting examination of the political landscape in Argentina, the fall of the dominating ideological and organizing political structures of Argentinian life for pretty much 80 years now. So I think it's interesting. Western Hemisphere stuff is what actually matters to the United States, and nobody pays any attention to it. So that is what I'm going to recommend for our people this week. The End of Peronism, question mark, by Joseph Addington.
Okay, Justin, now you have to pick a Jude piece. I mean, just to keep it reciprocal. Well, what's your pick of the week?
My pick of the week is going to be Spencer's piece, "The Surprising Campaign of Zohran Mamdani." I thought it was a great piece. Spencer goes in and digs, into his backstory, looks at the campaign so far, and he wrote this, when it looked like Zohran would probably lose to Cuomo. Um, but it points out a lot of the strengths and a lot of the reasons that he would go on to actually win the primary.
Yep,
So I think it's a
that
good
was a very
piece
good
and it's
piece.
well worth reading. And Spencer always is a great essayist. So highly recommend it.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of this episode of Tech Right Now. I want to remind our listeners on podcast apps that you can watch a video version of this episode on YouTube. And if you are watching on YouTube, please hit the like button, please subscribe, leave a comment, let us know what you thought about the episode. And Jude, Joseph, thank you for the illuminating discussion, and I'll see you next time.